Chapter 1. The President's Gamble, May 1st, 2011. The White House, Washington, D.C. The air in the Situation Room is thick, heavy with the unspoken weight of a decade of grief and frustration. It is a small, windowless conference room, deep in the West Wing, designed for moments precisely like this. Moments where the fate of nations can pivot on a single decision, a single piece of information. The room is crowded, far more so than usual. President Barack Obama sits not at the head of the table but to the side, in a smaller chair, hunched forward, his focus absolute. To his right sits Brigadier General Marshal Brad Webb, monitoring a laptop that displays the live feed from a world away. Vice President Joe Biden, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, National Security Advisor Tom Donilon, they are all here. The highest echelons of American power, gathered in a space no larger than a modest living room, their faces illuminated by the cold, electronic glow of monitors. They are watching a ghost hunt. For nearly 10 years, Osama Bin Laden, the architect of the September 11th attacks, had vanished. He was a specter, a name whispered in the mountains of Afghanistan and the tribal regions of Pakistan, a phantom who haunted the American psyche. But now, intelligence, painstakingly gathered through years of dead ends and false starts, pointed to a single fortified compound in Abbottabad, a quiet, affluent city deep inside Pakistan. There was no definitive proof he was there, no photograph, no voice intercept. Only a chain of circumstantial evidence, a tapestry of shadows and whispers woven by the CIA. The intelligence was strong, perhaps 55% certain, perhaps as high as 80%, but it was not 100%. The man they believed to be inside, the tall, pacing figure tracked by drones, was codenamed the Pacer. The operation to get him was codenamed Neptune's Spear. The target himself was codenamed Geronimo. The president had made his decision 2 days prior, on the morning of April 29th, after a final, tense meeting. It's a go, he had said, setting in motion a cascade of secret orders that now culminated in this moment. 2 heavily modified, top-secret stealth Black Hawk helicopters were at this very minute slicing through the darkness of Pakistani airspace, flying low and fast to avoid radar. Their hulls packed with 24 of America's most elite special operators, SEAL Team 6. They were 100 miles inside a sovereign nation, a nation that was, officially, an ally, a nation that had no idea they were coming. The potential for disaster was immense. A crash, a firefight with the Pakistani military, a hostage situation, or worst of all, a raid on the wrong house, an assault that killed innocent people and came up empty, humiliating the United States on the world stage and shattering a fragile alliance. Robert Gates, a man who had served presidents of both parties, had been candid about the risks, reminding everyone of Desert One, the catastrophic failed mission to rescue American hostages in Iran in 1980. The ghosts of past failures were also present in that room. Every person there understood the stakes. For the president, it was the defining gamble of his presidency. A success would deliver a measure of justice that a wounded nation had craved for a decade. A failure would be politically ruinous, a strategic catastrophe. Hillary Clinton would later recall the suffocating tension, the feeling of being completely disconnected from the events they were watching. "I have no idea what's going on," she whispered to the president at one point. The feed they were watching was not a Hollywood movie. There were no helmet cams. They were seeing a grainy thermal image from a high-altitude drone, a silent top-down view of the compound. They could see shapes, figures moving, but the detail was vague, the narrative unclear. Then, suddenly, something went wrong. One of the helicopters, designated Chalk 1, approached the compound and began to wobble. It pitched, its tail rotor catching on a high wall. The pilot, a man of extraordinary skill, managed to prevent a catastrophic crash, but the aircraft was forced into a hard, controlled landing inside the compound walls. It was crippled, unable to take off again. The mission was not even 2 minutes old, and the primary exfiltration vehicle was already down. A collective, sharp intake of breath filled the Situation Room. The plan, meticulously rehearsed for weeks, had gone off script. The SEALs were now inside, but their exit was compromised. On the audio link, they could hear the calm, professional voice of the raid commander, Admiral William McRaven, patched in from his command post in Afghanistan. He was receiving updates from the team on the ground. His voice, a steady metronome against the rising tide of anxiety in Washington, relayed the facts. The team was safe. The crash had not caused significant injuries. They were proceeding with the mission, but a new clock was ticking. The sound of the crash would have alerted the entire neighborhood. How long until the Pakistani police, or worse, the army, arrived? What had been a covert infiltration was now a loud, conspicuous crash site. The SEALs moved with practiced efficiency, blowing through gates and doors, their movements a blur of controlled violence. They cleared the guest house, then the main building, floor by floor. The watchers in Washington could only see the drone feed from above, their imaginations left to fill in the brutal close-quarters reality of the fight happening inside those walls. They heard muffled reports of gunfire, relayed by McRaven. They were encountering resistance. Time seemed to stretch and compress. Seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt like an eternity. The silence in the Situation Room was absolute, broken only by the quiet clicks of keyboards and McRaven's voice. President Obama stared at the screen, his face a mask of stone. He later described the feeling, saying, "It was the longest 40 minutes of my life." He was the commander-in-chief, the man who had given the order, but in this moment he was a spectator, powerless to influence the outcome. He had rolled the dice. Now he could only watch as they tumbled through the dark half a world away. The team was moving up to the third floor. This was where the CIA analysts believed the Pacer and his family lived. This was the heart of the labyrinth. If Bin Laden was anywhere, he was here. The question that had driven a global manhunt for 3,520 days hung in the air, unspoken but felt by everyone. Was the ghost real? Was he finally cornered? Or had they chased a phantom into a catastrophic dead end? The world knew nothing of the drama unfolding in that small, crowded room, or in the darkened compound in Pakistan. But history was about to be written, and the men and women in the Situation Room could do nothing but wait for the report from the shadows. The next voice they heard would either announce a historic victory or a devastating failure. The fate of the mission, the presidency, and a decade-long quest for justice now rested in the hands of the men on the ground, fighting in the dark. The worst, or the best, was yet to come. Chapter 2. The Ghost of the Hindu Kush. To understand the man in the Abbottabad compound, to grasp the sheer scale of the global conflict he ignited, one must travel back in time, back to a world before the burning towers, before the declarations of war, before the name Osama Bin Laden was synonymous with terror. We must go back to the origins of the ghost, to the forces that shaped him, and the currents of history that carried him from privilege and obscurity to global infamy. He was born in 1957 in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, the 17th of over 50 children of Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, a construction magnate of Yemeni descent who had built a colossal fortune, becoming the favored builder of the Saudi royal family. Osama grew up not in poverty or desperation, but in immense wealth and privilege. The Saudi bin Laden Group was a corporate empire, responsible for renovating the holy mosques at Mecca and Medina. From his earliest days, Osama was surrounded by two powerful forces, staggering wealth and profound religious piety. He was described as a quiet, polite, and deeply devout young man. He studied economics and business administration at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, where he fell under the influence of two key figures. The first was Abdullah Azzam, a charismatic Palestinian Islamic scholar who advocated for a global defensive jihad to protect Muslim lands from foreign invasion. The second was Mohammed Qutb, the brother of the influential Egyptian Islamist Sayyid Qutb, whose writings argued that the world was steeped in a state of pre-Islamic ignorance, or Jahiliyyah, and that true Islam was locked in an existential struggle with the secular, materialistic West. These ideas planted a seed in the mind of the young, wealthy Saudi. They provided a framework, a grand narrative that explained the perceived humiliation and weakness of the Muslim world. It was not a failure of faith, they argued, but a failure to fight. The call to action did not take long to arrive. In December of 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, a brazen act of a godless communist superpower occupying a Muslim nation. For Abdullah Azzam and his followers, this was the moment they had been waiting for. This was the clear, unambiguous call to jihad. Azzam issued a fatwa, a religious ruling declaring that the fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan was a personal obligation for all able-bodied Muslim men. He moved to Peshawar, Pakistan, a frontier city teeming with refugees and intrigue, and established the Maktab el-Khidamat, or the Services Bureau, a recruitment and logistics hub for foreign fighters wanting to join the Afghan Mujahideen. Osama bin Laden, then just 22 years old, answered the call. He traveled to Pakistan, bringing with him his family's fortune, his organizational skills, and his quiet, burning zeal. He was not, by most accounts, a great warrior. He was tall and gangly, not a natural commander on the battlefield. But his contribution was arguably more important. He became a financier, a fundraiser, and a logistician for the cause. He used his construction expertise to build roads and tunnels for the Mujahideen. He used his wealth to fund training camps and supply lines. He used his connections to draw in thousands of other young Arab men, who came to be known as the Afghan Arabs. They came from Egypt, Algeria, Yemen, and beyond, drawn by the promise of religious duty and righteous battle. In the crucible of the Afghan war, something new was forged. For these foreign fighters, the conflict was not just about liberating Afghanistan. It was about purifying themselves and resurrecting a lost sense of Islamic power and glory. They were fighting alongside Afghan warriors, but they were also supported by a strange and unlikely ally, the United States. Through the CIA's Operation Cyclone, America was pouring billions of dollars in advanced weaponry, like the game-changing Stinger missile, into the hands of the Mujahideen to bleed the Soviet Union. It was a classic Cold War proxy fight. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. American intelligence saw the Mujahideen as heroic freedom fighters, a convenient tool to bloody their superpower rival. They paid little attention to the radical ideology brewing within the camps of the Afghan Arabs. They did not see the long-term danger. They saw only the short-term goal, defeating the Soviets. Bin Laden experienced combat firsthand, participating in several battles including the Battle of Jaji in 1987. Though its military significance was minor, his propagandists would later mythologize it as a heroic stand where a small band of Arab fighters held off a much larger Soviet force. It burnished his credentials and solidified his status as a veteran of the Holy War. When the Soviets finally withdrew in defeat in 1989, it was a moment of profound vindication for bin Laden and his followers. A ragtag army of believers had brought a superpower to its knees. The lesson seemed clear. Faith and asymmetric warfare could defeat even the mightiest of modern armies. This victory gave them an intoxicating sense of power and destiny. But it also left them with a question: what now? They were a hardened, trained, and ideologically unified force of veterans. Abdullah Azzam believed they should continue to focus on liberating Muslim lands currently under occupation, like Palestine. But bin Laden had a different vision, one that was grander and more terrifying. He had come to see the world as divided into two camps, the camp of Islam and the camp of the crusading infidel West, led by the United States. He believed the real enemy was not the far enemy of the Soviets, but the near enemy of corrupt secular Arab regimes propped up by the far enemy America. In 1988, as the war in Afghanistan was winding down, he and a small circle of his most trusted lieutenants, including the Egyptian doctor Ayman al-Zawahiri, formalized their new organization. They called it Al-Qaeda, which translates to the base. It was intended to be a vanguard, a registry of veterans from the Afghan jihad who could be called upon for future battles. The name itself was deceptively simple, almost bureaucratic, but its purpose was apocalyptic. The first major test of this new worldview came swiftly. In 1990, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait. The Saudi royal family, fearing they were next, made a fateful decision. They invited American troops onto Saudi soil to protect the kingdom. For bin Laden, this was a profound betrayal, a desecration. The land of the two holy mosques, the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad, was now occupied by hundreds of thousands of American infidel soldiers. He had offered the services of his Afghan Arab veterans to defend the kingdom, but he was rebuffed in favor of the American military. This insult, this perceived pollution of sacred ground, radicalized him completely. It confirmed his belief that the Saudi monarchy was illegitimate and that America was the true occupying power, the head of the serpent. His public criticism of the royal family led to his exile. He relocated to Sudan in 1991, a pariah state that welcomed him and his resources. From there, he began to build Al-Qaeda into a global network. He established businesses as fronts, purchased training camps, and began to plan attacks. His focus was now singular: to drive the United States out of the Middle East and topple the regimes it supported. His rhetoric grew more and more violent. He saw America's presence in the region, its support for Israel, and its economic sanctions on Iraq as a declaration of war against Islam itself. He began to issue fatwas calling for the killing of Americans, both military and civilian. In 1996, under intense pressure from the US and Saudi Arabia, Sudan expelled him. He returned to the one place he felt safe, the one place he was a hero: Afghanistan. The country was now under the control of the Taliban, a fundamentalist movement that had emerged from the ashes of the civil war that followed the Soviet withdrawal. The Taliban's leader, the reclusive Mullah Omar, granted bin Laden sanctuary. In the rugged, isolated landscape of Afghanistan, shielded by a sympathetic regime, Al-Qaeda found its perfect haven. Bin Laden established a headquarters, ran sophisticated training camps, and plotted his global war. He was no longer just a financier or an ideologue. He was the commander, the emir, of a stateless army with global ambitions. On August 23, 1996, from a cave in the mountains of Tora Bora, he issued his formal declaration of war against the Americans occupying the land of the two holy places. In it, he wrote, "The walls of oppression and humiliation cannot be destroyed, except in a rain of bullets." Few in the West paid it much attention. He was seen as a fringe figure, a distant threat. But for those in the intelligence community who were watching, the declaration was a chilling statement of intent. The quiet, pious son of a billionaire had become the ghost of the Hindu Kush, a man who now commanded a global network dedicated to mass murder. The stage was set for a collision of worlds. The long, quiet years of preparation were over. The war was about to begin in earnest, and America was about to learn the name Osama Bin Laden in the most brutal way imaginable. The ghost was coming out of the mountains, and he was bringing hell with him. Chapter 3. A fire in the sky. The war declared from a cave in Afghanistan did not arrive in America all at once. It came in stages, in a series of escalating attacks that served as bloody signposts on the road to September 11th. Each event was a test, a probe of American defenses and resolve. Each went largely unanswered, emboldening al-Qaeda and reinforcing bin Laden's belief that the United States was a paper tiger, a decadent superpower, with no stomach for a real fight. The first major strike came on August 7, 1998. It was a date chosen for its symbolism, the 8th anniversary of the arrival of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia. At approximately 10:30 a.m. local time, two massive truck bombs detonated almost simultaneously outside the U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The blasts were immense, catastrophic. They tore the facades off the buildings, shattered glass for miles, and sent fireballs and clouds of debris billowing into the sky. In Nairobi, the explosion was so powerful it ripped a neighboring building to shreds, where most of the casualties occurred. In total, 224 people were killed, including 12 Americans. Over 4,500 people were wounded. The attacks were a brutal announcement of al-Qaeda's global reach and its utter disregard for civilian life. For most Americans, the news was a distant tragedy, a headline from a faraway continent. But inside the U.S. intelligence community, it was a seismic shock. The CIA, led by its counterterrorism chief Coffer Black, and the FBI, with agents like John O'Neill, had been tracking al-Qaeda for years. They knew of bin Laden, they knew of his threats, but the scale and sophistication of the embassy bombings revealed a level of operational capability they had not fully appreciated. President Bill Clinton responded swiftly. On August 20th, he ordered cruise missile strikes against al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan and a pharmaceutical plant in Sudan, suspected of producing chemical weapons precursors for the group. The operation was codenamed Infinite Reach. 79 Tomahawk missiles were launched from U.S. Navy ships in the Arabian Sea. But the strikes were a failure. The intelligence on the Sudanese plant was later disputed, leading to international criticism. More importantly, the strikes in Afghanistan missed their primary target. Bin Laden, who had been at one of the camps, had left just hours before the missiles arrived. For al-Qaeda, the failed retaliation was a propaganda victory. Bin Laden emerged from the rubble unscathed, his prestige soaring in the jihadist world. He had struck the superpower and survived its wrath. He appeared on camera, defiant, walking through the mountains, and declared, "The battle has been moved inside America." The message was clear: there was more to come. The intelligence community redoubled its efforts. The CIA's bin Laden unit, codenamed Alex Station, worked feverishly to track his movements and disrupt his network. They developed a plan, known as the Box, to capture him using Afghan tribal assets. But the plans were fraught with risk and complexity, and they never received the final green light from the White House, which feared the consequences of a failed operation or unacceptable collateral damage. The millennium approached, and with it, a heightened sense of dread. Intelligence agencies around the world were picking up a massive spike in chatter, indicating that al-Qaeda was planning something big to mark the year 2000. This led to the disruption of the Millennium Plot, including the arrest of Ahmed Rassam, an Algerian operative caught at the U.S.-Canada border in Port Angeles, Washington, with a car full of explosives. His target was Los Angeles International Airport. A catastrophe was averted, but it was a chilling reminder of al-Qaeda's ambition to strike the American homeland. Then on October 12, 2000, al-Qaeda struck again. The USS Cole, a billion-dollar Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, was refueling in the port of Aden, Yemen. As sailors lined up for lunch, a small fiberglass boat approached the warship. The two men aboard smiled and waved. As they pulled alongside the hull, they detonated their explosive-laden craft. The blast tore a 40 by 60-foot hole in the side of the ship, killing 17 American sailors and wounding 39. It was a daring, meticulously planned attack that once again demonstrated al-Qaeda's patience and tactical ingenuity. The investigation, led by the FBI's John O'Neill, was hampered by jurisdictional squabbles with the CIA and a lack of cooperation from Yemeni authorities. While the evidence quickly pointed to al-Qaeda, The transition between the Clinton and new George W. Bush administrations in early 2001 meant that a forceful military response was delayed and ultimately never came. This pattern of attack and limited response created a dangerous dynamic. In bin Laden's eyes, America was weak. He had attacked their embassies, their warships, and they had responded with a few errant cruise missiles and legal indictments. He believed they lacked the will for a prolonged, bloody conflict. Throughout this period, the warning signs of a much larger plot were accumulating, scattered like puzzle pieces across the globe. In Malaysia, CIA surveillance photographed known al-Qaeda operatives, including future 9/11 hijackers, Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, meeting with a key planner of the Cole bombing. But due to a breakdown in communication, this information was not shared with the FBI, and the men were not placed on a watch list that would have prevented them from entering the United States. They subsequently entered the country legally and began living openly in San Diego. In Minnesota, an FBI agent named Harry Samit grew deeply suspicious of a French-Moroccan student named Zacharias Moussaoui, who was taking flight lessons but showed no interest in learning how to land. Samit arrested him on an immigration violation and frantically tried to get a warrant to search his laptop, writing in a memo that he was convinced Moussaoui was part of a plot to fly a plane into the World Trade Center. His request was denied by superiors at FBI headquarters. In Phoenix, another agent wrote a memo detailing an alarming number of Middle Eastern men enrolling in U.S. flight schools, urging a nationwide review. The memo was largely ignored. In the summer of 2001, the intelligence system was, as the 9/11 Commission report would later state, blinking red. CIA Director George Tenet and his counter-terrorism chief Culfer Black were, in Tenet's words, running around with their hair on fire. They repeatedly warned the White House that a major, spectacular attack was imminent. A presidential daily briefing delivered to President Bush on August 6, 2001 at his ranch in Crawford, Texas, was titled, "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S." But the warnings were vague on the specifics of timing, method, and location. There was a failure of imagination, an inability to connect the dots and conceive of an attack of such audacious, horrifying scale. And so, on the morning of September 11, 2001, the fire that bin Laden had ignited in the mountains of Afghanistan finally reached America's shores. It was a beautiful, clear blue morning on the East Coast. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767 en route from Boston to Los Angeles, slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. At first it seemed like a horrific accident. Then, 17 minutes later, at 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175, another 767, banked sharply in the sky over New York Harbor and plunged into the South Tower. In that moment, all doubt vanished. This was a deliberate, coordinated attack. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the western side of the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, the very heart of America's military power, and at 10:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93, believed to be heading for a target in Washington, D.C., possibly the White House or the Capitol building, crashed into an empty field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, after its passengers and crew courageously fought back against the hijackers. In the space of 102 minutes, al-Qaeda had turned civilian airliners into guided missiles, murdering 2,977 innocent people from over 90 countries. The iconic symbols of American economic and military might were burning. The Twin Towers, those titans of the New York skyline, crumbled into dust, live on television for the entire world to see. The nation was paralyzed by shock, grief, and a terrifying sense of vulnerability. The fire in the sky had finally arrived. The ghost of the Hindu Kush had done what he had promised. He had moved the battle inside America. The world that existed on September 10th was gone forever, and in its place was a new and terrifying era, an era that would be defined by a single, all-consuming question: where is Osama bin Laden? The hunt was about to begin. Chapter 4. The Hunter and the Hunted. In the immediate aftermath of September 11th, a stunned and grieving nation turned its eyes to one man, President George W. Bush. The attacks had transformed his presidency. He had campaigned on domestic issues, on being a compassionate conservative. Now he was a wartime president, thrust into a global conflict against a shadowy, unconventional enemy. His response in the days that followed would set the tone for the decade-long hunt to come. Standing amidst the rubble at Ground Zero in New York City, with a bullhorn in his hand, he articulated the nation's raw anger and resolve. When a rescue worker shouted that he couldn't hear him, the president replied with words that would become iconic: "I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon." It was a promise of vengeance, a vow that resonated deeply with a wounded country. A few days later, addressing a joint session of Congress, he laid out the new doctrine that would guide American foreign policy. Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there, he declared. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. He issued a stark ultimatum to the world, and specifically to the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. They will hand over the terrorists, or they will share in their fate. He made the hunt personal, framing it in the stark, simple language of the American West. When asked about Osama bin Laden, he famously said, "I want justice." And there's an old poster out west, as I recall, that said, "Wanted, dead or alive." This rhetoric galvanized public support and gave clear, unambiguous marching orders to the American military and intelligence apparatus. The hunter-in-chief had spoken. The primary instrument for that hunt would be the Central Intelligence Agency. At its helm was Director George Tenet, a holdover from the Clinton administration who now found himself at the center of the storm. Tenet had been warning about bin Laden for years, and now he was given a blank check and unprecedented authority to dismantle Al-Qaeda. He unleashed the CIA's Counter-Terrorist Center, or CTC, led by the aggressive and profane Cofer Black. Black's instructions to his teams were blunt. "I want to see photos of their heads on pikes," he reportedly told them. "I want to see their heads on dry ice. I want to be able to show them to the president." He famously promised to bring bin Laden back in a box. The first wave of the hunt was a small group of CIA paramilitary officers from the Special Activities Division, joined by U.S. Army Special Forces. The first team, codenamed Jawbreaker, led by a legendary CIA officer named Gary Schroen, landed in Afghanistan just 15 days after 9/11. They carried suitcases filled with millions of dollars in cash to buy the loyalty of Afghan warlords in the Northern Alliance, the primary opposition to the Taliban. Their mission was to link up with these militias, advise them, and call in devastating American air power to break the Taliban's front lines. One of the key figures on the ground was Gary Berntsen, another veteran CIA officer who would lead the teams hunting bin Laden in eastern Afghanistan. These were not diplomats. They were grizzled, experienced field operatives, comfortable with ambiguity and violence, tasked with navigating the treacherous landscape of Afghan tribal politics to find and kill the world's most wanted man. While the CIA and Special Forces operated in the shadows, the public face of the hunt was the United States military, led by Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and General Tommy Franks of U.S. Central Command. On October 7, 2001, Operation Enduring Freedom began, with American and British warplanes pounding Taliban and Al-Qaeda targets across Afghanistan. The strategy was to use a small footprint of elite American troops on the ground to guide a massive air campaign, leveraging local Afghan forces to do the bulk of the ground fighting. It was a revolutionary approach to warfare, and initially it was stunningly effective. The Taliban regime, which had seemed so entrenched, crumbled in a matter of weeks. By November, the Northern Alliance had captured Kabul. The hunters were closing in. On the other side of this global dragnet was the hunted Osama bin Laden. He was not a lone wolf. He was the leader of a complex, resilient organization, surrounded by a coterie of loyal and dangerous lieutenants. His second-in-command was Ayman al-Zawahiri, an Egyptian surgeon and the intellectual force behind Al-Qaeda. Where bin Laden was charismatic and serene, Zawahiri was stern, pedantic, and ideologically rigid. He was the strategist, the one who had merged his own Egyptian Islamic Jihad group with Al-Qaeda, giving it a core of experienced, hardened militants. Another key figure was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, or KSM, the self-proclaimed architect of the 9/11 plot. A Kuwaiti-born Pakistani, KSM was a flamboyant, brilliant, and utterly ruthless operational planner. He was the mastermind who had conceived of using airplanes as weapons and had sold the idea to bin Laden. He represented the operational heart of Al-Qaeda, the man who turned ideological hatred into mass casualty attacks. And then there was the network that protected bin Laden himself, a layered system of bodyguards, facilitators, and most importantly, couriers. Bin Laden understood that in the modern age, any form of electronic communication was a death sentence. A satellite phone call, an email, a radio transmission, all could be intercepted and traced. So he went dark. He reverted to the oldest form of communication, human messengers. He relied on a small, trusted circle of men to carry his messages, both written and memorized, to the outside world. This discipline made him a ghost. It severed the electronic links that American intelligence relied upon, forcing the hunt to become a slow, painstaking process of human intelligence, of finding and turning the people who made up his hidden world. As the Taliban regime collapsed around him in the autumn of 2001, Bin Laden and the al-Qaeda leadership retreated from the cities of Kandahar and Jalalabad, falling back to their final redoubt, the mountainous region of Tora Bora in eastern Afghanistan near the Pakistani border. This was familiar territory. It was a labyrinth of steep valleys, narrow gorges, and deep caves that Bin Laden himself had helped fortify during the war against the Soviets. He was a man who had spent years preparing for a moment just like this. He was surrounded by hundreds of his most loyal Arab fighters, men who would willingly die for him. He believed he could withstand the American onslaught, bleed the invaders in the mountains, and either escape to fight another day or die a martyr's death, a final glorious act of defiance. The hunters and the hunted were now on a collision course. The vast technological and military might of the United States was bearing down on one man and his band of followers, hidden in a medieval landscape of rock and ice. The CIA, the Special Forces and their Afghan allies were closing the net. Gary Burnson and his team were on the ground, directing B-52 strikes that shook the mountains to their foundations. They believed they had him cornered. The final confrontation seemed imminent. The fate of the world's most wanted man, and the outcome of the first chapter of the War on Terror, would be decided in the cold, unforgiving mountains of Tora Bora. The stage was set for a battle that would come to define the frustrations, the miscalculations, and the missed opportunities of the entire 10-year hunt. A battle that would allow the ghost to slip through their fingers, disappearing into the shadows for years to come. Chapter 5. The Battle of Tora Bora, December 2001. The mountains of eastern Afghanistan. The landscape is brutal, primeval, jagged, snow-dusted peaks claw at a steel-gray sky. The air is thin and bitterly cold. This is Tora Bora, a name that would soon become synonymous with a critical, perhaps fatal, miscalculation in the hunt for Osama bin Laden. After the fall of Kabul and Kandahar, the remnants of al-Qaeda's foreign fighters, along with their leader, had retreated to this natural fortress near the Pakistani border. It was a place they knew well, a complex of caves and tunnels they had used and improved for over a decade. Intelligence reports, including radio intercepts and information from captured fighters, all pointed to one conclusion. Bin Laden was here. He was trapped. For the American forces on the ground, it felt like the endgame. The CIA team, led by Gary Burnson, working alongside U.S. Army Special Forces detachments, was orchestrating the assault. Their strategy was a continuation of the model that had worked so well across the rest of Afghanistan. A small number of elite American operators advising and guiding large numbers of local Afghan militia fighters, with overwhelming American air power as the hammer. The plan was to use two Afghan warlords, Hazrat Ali and Haji Zaman, to advance from opposite sides, squeezing the al-Qaeda fighters into a kill box. From above, the U.S. Air Force unleashed a relentless bombardment. B-52 bombers, flying so high they were invisible from the ground, dropped massive payloads of satellite-guided bombs. Fighter jets streaked through the valleys, hitting cave entrances and enemy positions with precision munitions. The awesome power of the American military was focused on this one small patch of the White Mountains. The sound was deafening, a continuous, earth-shaking roar of explosions that echoed through the canyons day and night. The ground itself trembled. Special Forces soldiers on observation posts called in the strikes, watching through binoculars as entire mountainsides disappeared in clouds of smoke and pulverized rock. One of the most powerful non-nuclear weapons in the American arsenal, the BLU-82, known as the Daisy Cutter, was dropped. It was a 15,000-pound bomb that detonated just above the ground, incinerating everything within a 600-yard radius. The psychological effect was intended to be as devastating as the physical one. On the ground, the fighting was savage. The al-Qaeda fighters, mostly Arabs, Chechens, and Uzbeks, were cornered and desperate. They were also highly motivated and well-trained. They fought with a ferocity that stunned the Afghan militia. They launched counterattacks, set up deadly ambushes, and used the terrain to their advantage, disappearing into the labyrinthine cave system. The Afghan militia fighters, while brave, were not always reliable. Their loyalties were complex, and their willingness to press the attack against the fanatical foreign fighters wavered. They would advance, take casualties, and then retreat to regroup. Progress was slow, bloody, and frustrating. Amidst this chaos, the American teams on the ground were convinced they had their man. They were intercepting bin Laden's voice on the radio. He was heard directing his fighters, encouraging them, and at one point, even apologizing for leading them into this trap. Gary Burnson, the CIA commander, was certain it was him. He repeatedly requested that a force of U.S. Army Rangers, some 800 of whom were stationed just a short flight away in southern Afghanistan, be deployed to Tora Bora. His argument was simple and urgent. the Afghan militias could not be trusted to seal the back door. The only way to ensure bin Laden and the al-Qaeda leadership could not escape across the porous border into Pakistan's tribal areas was to insert a blocking force of American soldiers on the mountain passes. Bernson believed that with a battalion of Rangers, he could guarantee bin Laden's capture or death. He sent his request up the chain of command. "We need Rangers," he pleaded. The request went from the CIA station in Kabul to CENTCOM headquarters in Tampa, Florida, where General Tommy Franks was in command, and ultimately to the Pentagon, where Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld was overseeing the war. The decision came back. No, the request was denied. The reasoning behind this decision has been debated for years. Rumsfeld and Franks were committed to the small footprint model. They believed a large deployment of U.S. ground troops would be seen as an occupation, alienating the Afghan population, and getting America bogged down in a bloody ground war, reminiscent of the Soviet experience. They worried about the casualties that a direct assault by U.S. troops into the cave complexes would entail. They placed their faith in air power and in their Afghan allies. They believed the Pakistani military would seal their side of the border, preventing any escape. It was a catastrophic misjudgment. The Pakistani military did little to block the escape routes, and the Afghan militias, as Bernson had feared, proved unreliable. At a critical moment, one of the warlords, Haji Zaman, agreed to a temporary ceasefire to allow for the surrender of the al-Qaeda fighters. It was a ruse. The pause in the fighting gave bin Laden and his inner circle the window they needed. Under the cover of darkness, in small groups, they slipped away. They were guided by local Afghans who knew the mountain passes intimately, men whose loyalty could be bought. They moved through the high, unguarded trails, melting into the ungoverned tribal areas of Pakistan, a region where they had allies and where American forces could not legally go. By the time the Afghan militias finally overran the last al-Qaeda positions in mid-December, the prize was gone. They found abandoned caves, empty trenches, and the bodies of several dozen fighters. They also found letters and documents, but of Osama bin Laden and the senior leadership, there was no sign. The ghost had vanished. The Battle of Tora Bora was over. It was presented as a victory. A major al-Qaeda stronghold had been destroyed. Hundreds of their fighters had been killed or captured. But within the intelligence community and the special operations forces on the ground, there was a bitter sense of failure, a profound feeling of a historic opportunity squandered. They had him. He was in their grasp, and they let him get away. Dalton Fury, the pseudonym of the Delta Force commander on the ground at Tora Bora, would later write that the failure to commit U.S. troops to block the escape routes was one of the greatest military mistakes of the 21st century. The consequences of this failure were immense. The hunt for Osama bin Laden, which could have ended just 3 months after it began, was now transformed. It would not be a short, decisive campaign. It would become a long, grinding, frustrating marathon. Bin Laden's escape reinforced his myth. He had taken on the full might of the American military, and survived. In the eyes of his followers, he was now invincible, protected by divine will. He would reconstitute his leadership in Pakistan, and from his new sanctuary, he would continue to inspire and direct a global insurgency. The focus of the Bush administration, meanwhile, was already beginning to shift. The rhetoric coming out of Washington was increasingly focused not on the mountains of Afghanistan, but on Iraq and Saddam Hussein. The trail for bin Laden was going cold. The hunter had lost the scent, and the hunted was now free to disappear into the wilderness, where he would remain silent, a phantom in the shadows, for years to come. Chapter 6. Years of Silence. The escape from Tora Bora marked the beginning of a new phase in the hunt for Osama bin Laden. The intense, kinetic chase through the mountains of Afghanistan gave way to something far more difficult, a search for a man who had mastered the art of invisibility. For nearly a decade, the world's most wanted man would remain a ghost, his whereabouts a complete mystery. This period, from roughly 2002 to 2010, would become known as the Lost Years, a time of profound frustration for the intelligence agencies hunting him, and a time when the world began to wonder if he was even still alive. After slipping into Pakistan's federally administered tribal areas, or FATA, bin Laden implemented a security protocol of extreme discipline. He ceased all forms of electronic communication. He knew that America's greatest strength was its signals intelligence, its ability to hoover up electronic emissions from anywhere on the planet. A single satellite phone call had led to the death of the Chechen leader Dzhokhar Dudayev. Bin Laden would not make the same mistake. He communicated only through a handful of trusted human couriers who would travel great distances to deliver and receive messages, often on small encrypted memory sticks. This reliance on pre-modern methods effectively blinded the vast American surveillance machine. They could listen to the entire world, but they could not hear a whisper. The hunt became a search for a needle in a haystack the size of a subcontinent, and worse, the needle wasn't talking. The focus of the American government also shifted dramatically. In March of 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. The war on terror, which had begun with a laser-like focus on Al-Qaeda and Afghanistan, was now reoriented towards Baghdad and the removal of Saddam Hussein. Resources, intelligence assets, special operations forces, and most importantly, political attention were diverted to this new front. The hunt for bin Laden, while still officially a top priority, was overshadowed. Many of the key analysts and operatives who had been dedicated to finding him were reassigned to the Iraq problem. For those who remained on the bin Laden trail, it was a period of deep demoralization. They felt that the country had taken its eye off the ball, chasing a threat in Iraq that had no connection to 9/11s, while the man actually responsible for the attacks remained at large. The years dragged on with a frustrating lack of progress. There were tantalizing but ultimately fruitless leads. Sightings were reported everywhere, from the mountains of Chitral in Pakistan to the deserts of Iran. Each one had to be investigated, costing time and resources, and each one led to a dead end. The CIA spent millions of dollars on programs to gather intelligence, some of them controversial. The enhanced interrogation techniques used on high-value detainees like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Abu Zubaydah were justified in part as necessary to extract information about bin Laden's location. While these interrogations yielded a vast amount of intelligence about Al-Qaeda's structure, methods, and past plots, they provided no actionable intelligence on bin Laden's current whereabouts. The men who knew, if they knew at all, were not talking. KSM, under intense questioning, reportedly told his interrogators, "Soon you will kill me, but I will have my victory. I will have destroyed you." He gave them nothing that led them closer to his boss. The silence from bin Laden himself was deafening. For long stretches, there would be no new messages, leading to rampant speculation. Was he dead? Had he been killed in the Tora Bora bombing and secretly buried? Was he incapacitated by illness? He was known to suffer from kidney problems, and rumors of his demise were constant. Then, just as the world was ready to write him off, a message would appear, a grainy video or a scratchy audio recording, smuggled out of his hiding place and delivered to a television network like Al Jazeera. In these messages, he would appear gaunt, aged, but defiant. He would taunt the United States, comment on world events, and call for new attacks. A 2004 video, released just before the US presidential election, showed him calmly and directly addressing the American people, admitting for the first time his direct responsibility for the 9/11's attacks. "Your security is not in the hands of Kerry or Bush or Al-Qaeda," he said. "Your security is in your own hands." Each new message was a jolt to the system. It proved he was alive, that he was still in command, and that the global hunt had so far failed. For the intelligence analysts, each message was a precious opportunity. They would dissect every frame of the videos, every word of the audio. Geologists would analyze the rock formations behind him. Botanists would study the plants. Linguists would parse his choice of words for clues about his state of mind. Audio technicians would analyze the background noise for any hint of location, a bird call, a distant engine. But he was too careful. The backgrounds were always neutral, a plain cloth, a bare wall. The messages were stripped of any identifying information. They were a reminder of his presence, but a confirmation of his elusiveness. The years of silence took a psychological toll. The public grew weary of a war with no end in sight. The phrase, "Where is Osama bin Laden?" became a political cudgel, a symbol of the government's perceived incompetence. The man himself began to seem less like a real person, and more like a myth, a legendary boogeyman who had transcended his own mortality. But behind the scenes, a small dedicated group of analysts at the CIA never gave up. They were sometimes called the Sisterhood, a group of predominantly female analysts who had been working the Al-Qaeda problem since before 9/11s. They were relentless, obsessive. They worked pushing hours, sacrificing their personal lives, poring over mountains of data. They believed that even a ghost leaves a trace, and they were determined to find it. They knew they couldn't track bin Laden directly. The only way to find him was to find the people who connected him to the outside world. His couriers. For years they had been collecting names, fragments of information from detainee interrogations. One name, a nom de guerre, kept coming up: Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti. Detainees described him as a trusted aide, a close associate of KSM, and crucially, a courier for the senior leadership. But who was he, and where was he? Finding this man became the central obsession of the hunt. It was the one thin thread that might, if pulled carefully, unravel the entire mystery. But al-Kuwaiti had vanished after 2001, just like his boss. For years the trail was cold. Some intelligence suggested he was dead. The hunt seemed to be at a permanent impasse. The ghost remained hidden. The silence continued. But the sisters at the CIA kept digging. They sifted through old interrogation reports, re-interviewed detainees, and cross-referenced vast databases of information. They refused to believe the trail had gone cold forever. They believed the key was out there, buried in the noise. The hunt for Osama bin Laden had become a war of patience, a test of endurance, and as the decade drew to a close, a new president, Barack Obama, would inherit this frustrating, seemingly endless search. He would make it clear to his intelligence chiefs that finding bin Laden was once again the nation's top priority. The pressure was on. After years of silence, the hunters needed a breakthrough. And slowly, painstakingly, through the sheer dogged persistence of a few determined analysts, that breakthrough was about to come. The thread was about to be found. Chapter 7. The Breadcrumb Trail. The breakthrough in the hunt for Osama bin Laden did not come from a dramatic firefight or a high-tech satellite image. It came from a whisper in a secret prison, a name spoken under duress, a single breadcrumb dropped in the wilderness of global intelligence. The name was Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, and the story of how the CIA followed that name from the black sites of Eastern Europe to the doorstep of their target is a masterclass in the slow, grinding, often morally complex work of modern espionage. The name first surfaced in the years immediately following 9/11. High-value detainees, including the operational mastermind Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and the alleged 20th hijacker, Mohammed al-Qahtani, mentioned al-Kuwaiti during their interrogations. They described him as a key member of al-Qaeda's inner circle, a Pakistani man born in Kuwait who had grown up with and was deeply trusted by the 9/11 plotters. More importantly, they identified him as a courier, a protege of KSM who had provided assistance to the 9/11 hijackers, and was now serving as a messenger for the senior leadership. But KSM and the others were also masters of deception. Under interrogation, they seemed to engage in a coordinated campaign of misinformation. They claimed that al-Kuwaiti had left al-Qaeda, that he had retired from jihad, and that he was no longer in contact with the group. Some even suggested he was dead. They seemed to be deliberately downplaying his importance, trying to throw the hunters off his scent. For years, this tactic worked. The lead on al-Kuwaiti went cold. His file was marked as inactive. The focus shifted to other potential leads, other names, other avenues of investigation. The breadcrumb had been dropped, but it lay undiscovered on the forest floor. The turning point came in 2007. A new team of CIA analysts, part of the dedicated group that never gave up on the hunt, decided to systematically review all the old intelligence. They were looking for inconsistencies, for threads that had been missed. They became convinced that the detainees had been lying about al-Kuwaiti. The very fact that so many high-level al-Qaeda figures had tried to push investigators away from him suggested he was in fact incredibly important. They reasoned that if he was just a minor figure, why go to such lengths to protect him? They theorized that al-Kuwaiti wasn't just a courier. He was likely the primary, most trusted courier for Osama bin Laden himself. This hypothesis re-energized the search. Finding al-Kuwaiti was no longer just one of many tasks. It became the central focus of the entire intelligence effort. But they still didn't know his real name or where he was. The hunt became a massive multi-year effort to uncover his true identity. It used the vast powers of the National Security Agency to sift through a global ocean of electronic data. They were looking for any phone call, any email, any financial transaction connected to al-Kuwaiti's known relatives or associates. It was a search of unimaginable scale, connecting faint signals across continents. Finally, in 2009, they got a hit. They intercepted a phone call. A man in a Pakistani city was speaking to a relative who was being monitored. In the course of the conversation, the man used a name that analysts were able to connect, through a web of other intelligence, to the nom de guerre Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti. They now had his real name, Ibrahim Saeed Ahmed, and they had a general location, the bustling, chaotic urban centers of Pakistan. The hunt now shifted from the virtual world to the real world. The CIA's station in Islamabad was tasked with the daunting mission of finding one man in a country of 180 million people. They used every tool at their disposal. They ran his name through databases. They put his family members under surveillance. They cultivated human sources. It was classic, on-the-ground spycraft. A world away from the high-tech drone operations in the tribal areas. In August of 2010, after months of painstaking work, they found him. A CIA informant spotted a distinctive white Suzuki SUV, a vehicle they had identified as being used by Ibrahim's family. The informant tailed the vehicle through the crowded streets of Peshawar. The driver was a man who matched the physical description of Ibrahim Saeed Ahmed. The CIA was now on him. They initiated a full-scale surveillance operation. Teams of Pakistani-American CIA officers, working in discreet vehicles, began to follow the white Suzuki. It was a delicate and dangerous dance. They had to remain invisible. If Ibrahim detected the surveillance, he would vanish, and the trail, their only trail, would go cold forever. They followed him for weeks as he went about his routine. He was incredibly careful, employing sophisticated counter-surveillance techniques. He would make sudden U-turns, pull into alleys, and take circuitous routes, constantly checking to see if he was being followed. This extreme tradecraft only confirmed the CIA's suspicions. This was not an ordinary man. This was a man with something, or someone, to hide. The surveillance continued, day after day, week after week. And then, one day, the white Suzuki led them somewhere they never expected. It did not lead them to a cave in the mountains, or a safe house in the lawless tribal areas. It led them to a large, 3-story compound in a quiet, middle-class suburb of a city called Abbottabad. The city itself was a surprise. Abbottabad was not a hotbed of militancy. It was a green, relatively peaceful garrison town, home to the Pakistani equivalent of West Point, the Kakul Military Academy. It was a place where Pakistani army officers retired. It seemed the last place on earth to hide the world's most wanted terrorist. But the compound itself was an anomaly. It was huge, 8 times larger than any other home in the neighborhood. It was surrounded by concrete walls, 12 to 18 feet high, topped with barbed wire. There were 2 security gates, and the main building had very few windows. The 3rd-floor terrace had a 7-foot privacy wall. Most bizarrely, the compound had no telephone lines and no internet service, despite its size and the apparent wealth of its occupants. The residents burned their trash rather than have it collected. It was a fortress, designed for maximum security and complete isolation from the outside world. The CIA set up a clandestine observation post in a rented house nearby and began to watch the compound 24/7. They used satellites and stealth drones to capture imagery from above. They used long-range listening devices and thermal imagers. They pieced together the life within those walls. They identified Ibrahim, his brother, and their families. But they also identified a 3rd family living in the main house, a family that never emerged from the compound. And they saw him, a tall, thin, bearded man who would come out to walk in the small courtyard for an hour or so each day. He never left the compound. He walked back and forth from one wall to the other, like a prisoner in a yard. They nicknamed him the Pacer. His height and appearance were consistent with that of Osama Bin Laden, but they could never get a clear look at his face. The privacy walls, the careful security, made it impossible. They had followed the breadcrumb trail to the end. It had led them to a fortress in Abbottabad, where a mysterious figure who fit the description of their target was living in complete seclusion, his only link to the world the very courier they had spent years searching for. The evidence was overwhelming, but it was all circumstantial. They had no positive identification. Was the Pacer truly Osama bin Laden? Or was it some other senior al-Qaeda figure? Or was the entire thing an elaborate decoy? The intelligence community was divided. The analysts who had worked the case for years were convinced. They felt it in their bones. This was him. But others were more skeptical, haunted by past intelligence failures, like the flawed intelligence that led to the war in Iraq. They needed more proof, but getting more proof without alerting the occupants of the compound was impossible. The time for gathering intelligence was coming to an end. A decision would have to be made. A decision based on probabilities, on inferences, on shadows. A decision that would lead either to a historic triumph or a humiliating disaster. Chapter 8. The Pacer. By the winter of 2010 and into the spring of 2011, the compound in Abbottabad had become the single most scrutinized piece of real estate on the planet. For the small circle of senior officials in the Obama administration who were briefed on the intelligence, it was an all-consuming obsession. Every piece of data, every satellite image, every scrap of information gathered from the surveillance operation was analyzed and debated in a series of tense, secret meetings held deep inside the White House. The man at the center of these deliberations was President Barack Obama. He had come into office promising to end the war in Iraq and refocus America's efforts on the fight against al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan. From his first days as president, he had made it clear to his CIA director, Leon Panetta, that finding Osama bin Laden was the highest priority of his administration. Now, Panetta and the CIA were bringing him a lead, the most significant lead in almost a decade. But it was not a certainty. It was a puzzle with a crucial piece missing: positive identification. The case for the Pacer being bin Laden was compelling. The custom-built high-security compound, the extreme measures taken to ensure secrecy, the presence of the trusted courier, Ibrahim Saeed Ahmed, also known as al-Kuwaiti. The physical characteristics of the pacer himself, his height, his gait, his reclusive habits, it all fit. The CIA's team of analysts, led by the women who had pursued the courier lead for years, presented their case with conviction. Their analysis concluded that there was a strong probability that bin Laden was living in the compound. They estimated the chances were somewhere between 60 and 80%. But other voices urged caution. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, a veteran of Washington who had seen intelligence failures up close, was deeply skeptical. He reminded the president of the faulty intelligence on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. He argued that the evidence was purely circumstantial. "We have no direct evidence that he's there," Gates warned. He estimated the odds at closer to 50-50, a coin toss. Vice President Joe Biden was also wary, concerned about the enormous political and strategic fallout if a raid went wrong. He worried about the potential for a catastrophic firefight with the Pakistani military, the collapse of a vital if troubled alliance, and the global humiliation that would follow an assault on an empty house. The president convened a series of National Security Council meetings to debate the options. The discussions were intense and exhaustive. 4 main courses of action were considered. The first option was to wait and continue gathering intelligence. Try to get that definitive piece of evidence, a DNA sample, a clear photograph, a voice recording. But this was deemed too risky. The longer they watched the compound, the greater the chance that their surveillance would be detected. If bin Laden's network realized they had been compromised, he would vanish again, perhaps forever. The window of opportunity was closing. The second option was a joint operation with the Pakistanis. Bring them into the circle of trust, share the intelligence, and ask them to conduct the raid themselves or alongside US forces. This was quickly dismissed. No one in the room trusted the Pakistani intelligence service, the ISI, not to leak the information. There were deep suspicions that elements within the ISI were sympathetic to, or even actively protecting, bin Laden. A leak would not only warn the target, but would also expose the CIA's sources and methods, including their Pakistani-American operatives on the ground. The third option was a standoff strike, most likely from a B-2 stealth bomber or cruise missiles. This had the advantage of having no risk to American lives, but it had major disadvantages. A massive bombing run would obliterate the compound, killing everyone inside, including the women and children the CIA had identified. It would be impossible to ever be 100% certain that bin Laden was among the dead. There would be no body, no proof. His followers could claim he was still alive, turning him into a martyr and a myth who could never be proven dead. Furthermore, the collateral damage in a residential neighborhood could be immense, creating a major international incident. This left the fourth option, a unilateral helicopter raid by US Special Operations Forces. This was the highest risk, highest reward option. It offered the best chance of definitively identifying and capturing or killing bin Laden, and recovering a trove of invaluable intelligence, computers, documents, and storage devices from the compound. But the risks were astronomical. The raid would involve flying 2 helicopters, 150 miles into sovereign Pakistani territory, completely undetected. If anything went wrong, a mechanical failure, detection by Pakistani radar, a confrontation with the Pakistani military, the result could be a disaster on the scale of the failed Desert 1 mission in Iran, or the Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia. The president went around the room, asking each of his senior advisors for their final recommendation. The opinions were divided. Secretary Gates and Vice President Biden leaned against the raid, favoring the less risky bombing option, or waiting for more intelligence. CIA Director Panetta and Secretary of State Clinton argued passionately in favor of the raid. Clinton, who had initially been cautious, became a firm advocate, arguing that the chance to get bin Laden was a historic opportunity that outweighed the risks. She reportedly said, "The decision was a go for me. It was as clear a go as you could get." The final decision rested with the president alone. He took his time, retreating to weigh the options. He was a deliberative, analytical leader, known for his calm under pressure. But the weight of this decision was immense. He later spoke of the loneliness of the moment, the knowledge that if the mission failed, the responsibility would be his and his alone. He played a game of cards in the White House to clear his head, went for a walk, and thought about the men he would be sending into harm's way. He thought about the potential for failure and the consequences for the country. But he also thought about the victims of 9/11 events, and the promise he had made to bring their killer to justice. On the morning of Friday, April 29, 2011, he gathered his national security team in the diplomatic reception room. He had made his choice. He did not poll them again. He simply announced his decision. It's a go. He was choosing the riskiest option. The raid. He was placing his trust in the skill and courage of the men of SEAL Team 6 and the pilots of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. The mission was set for the night of May 1st, a time when there would be little moonlight over Abbottabad, providing maximum cover for the helicopters. The order was given. The plan, meticulously rehearsed at full-scale mock-ups of the compound in both North Carolina and Nevada, was set in motion. The president was rolling the dice. He was betting his presidency and the lives of American servicemen on the CIA's circumstantial case. He was betting that the pacer, the ghostly figure walking circles in a Pakistani courtyard, was indeed the man who had haunted America for a decade. The hunt was about to reach its violent, uncertain climax. The world was about to find out if the ghost was real. Chapter 9. Geronimo. Jalalabad Airfield, Afghanistan. The sun has set on May 1st, 2011. The air is cool and still. On the tarmac sit two of the most advanced and secret aircraft in the world, heavily modified MH-60 Black Hawk helicopters, engineered for stealth. Their sharp angles, radar, absorbent skin, and quieted rotor systems are designed to make them all but invisible to enemy air defenses. Inside these machines, 23 U.S. Navy SEALs, from the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, popularly known as SEAL Team 6, conduct their final checks. They are a quiet, focused brotherhood, the tip of America's military spear. Each man is a repository of years of punishing training and combat experience. They are armed with suppressed rifles, sidearms, and explosive charges. They carry night vision goggles that will turn the darkness of their target into a world of green, ghostly clarity. Their mission is codenamed Operation Neptune's Spear. Their target is codenamed Geronimo. The flight into Pakistan is tense and silent. The Night Stalker pilots fly a harrowing nap-of-the-earth profile, skimming over the rugged terrain at high speed, using the mountains to mask their approach from Pakistani radar. For 90 minutes, they are deep inside a country that is not aware of their presence, a country that could at any moment scramble fighter jets to intercept them. They are completely on their own. As they approach Abbottabad, the compound comes into view through their night vision systems. It looks exactly like the satellite photos and the mock-up they trained on. It's real. The plan is for the first helicopter, Chalk 1, to hover over the central courtyard while the SEALs fast rope down. The second, Chalk 2, will deploy its team outside the compound to secure the perimeter. But as Chalk 1 descends into the confined space of the courtyard, something goes wrong. The helicopter enters a condition known as vortex ring state. The downwash from its own rotors gets trapped by the high compound walls, creating a vortex of turbulent air that robs the aircraft of lift. The pilot fights for control, but the helicopter begins to sink, its tail rotor striking the top of a 12-foot wall. With incredible skill, the pilot prevents a catastrophic rollover crash, instead bringing the crippled aircraft down in a controlled, if brutal, hard landing inside the compound. The mission is barely a minute old, and the plan is already shattered. The primary exfiltration aircraft is down, but there is no panic. The SEALs are trained for chaos. They exit the downed helicopter, and immediately revert to their alternate plan. Instead of fast roping, they are now fighting from the ground up. The team from Chalk 2, hearing the crash, lands outside and begins blowing through the outer walls with explosive charges to link up with their comrades. The quiet, stealthy infiltration has become a loud, violent assault. The sound of the crash and the explosions echo through the quiet suburban neighborhood. Lights begin to come on in nearby houses. A clock has started. The SEALs know they have, at most, 30 to 45 minutes before Pakistani forces might arrive. They move with lethal speed and precision. The first resistance comes from the guest house, a separate building in the courtyard. As the SEALs approach, the courier, Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, appears with an AK-47. He is shot and killed. Inside the main building's first floor, they encounter al-Kuwaiti's brother, who also opens fire. He too is killed, along with his wife, who is caught in the crossfire. The SEALs move methodically through the darkened building, a silent, deadly force. They clear the first floor, then the second, encountering women and children, whom they move to safety. Their objective is the third floor. This is where the intelligence indicated their target lived. A small team of SEALs ascends the final staircase. At the top of the stairs, they see him. Bin Laden's 23-year-old son, Khalid, emerges and is killed. The lead SEAL pushes past him and breaches the final door. Inside the room, it is dark. Through the green glow of night vision, they see two women, and behind them, a tall, thin man with a beard. He is unarmed but moves towards a weapon. There is no hesitation. The lead SEAL, Robert O'Neill, raises his rifle and fires. 2 rounds strike the man in the head. He falls to the floor. Another SEAL, Matt Bissonette, enters the room and fires several more rounds into the man's chest to ensure he is dead. It is over in seconds. The ghost, the man who had eluded the world for a decade, lies dead on the floor of a dark room in Abbottabad. A SEAL gets on the radio. The words are calm, professional, and electric with history. For God and country, Geronimo, Geronimo, Geronimo. A moment later, a more formal confirmation is transmitted to Admiral McRaven, who is monitoring the raid from Afghanistan. Geronimo Ikea, enemy killed in action. In the White House Situation Room, a world away, President Obama, who had been stone-faced throughout the tense approach and the crash, hears Leon Panetta relay the message. They've got him. They've got Geronimo. The president lets out a quiet breath. We got him, he says. But the mission is far from over. The SEALs must now confirm the identity of the man they have killed and gather as much intelligence as possible. One of the SEALs, a tall man chosen because he is roughly the same height as Bin Laden, lies down next to the body for a quick measurement. It matches. They take photographs and a DNA sample. While this is happening, other members of the team are racing through the compound, grabbing everything that looks like intelligence, computer hard drives, thumb drives, DVDs, and documents. They call this sensitive site exploitation. They are stuffing bags with a treasure trove of information that will provide an unprecedented look inside the mind and operations of Al-Qaeda's leader. Outside, the clock is ticking. The downed helicopter is a major problem. It contains classified stealth technology that cannot be left behind. The SEALs rig the aircraft with demolition charges. They move the women and children to a safe location away from the helicopter. A spare helicopter, a Chinook, has been called in from Afghanistan to carry out the remaining SEALs in the body. It arrives, along with the functioning Black Hawk from Chalk 2. The SEALs load the body bag, their intelligence haul, and themselves onto the 2 remaining aircraft. The demolition charges are detonated, and the secret stealth helicopter is consumed by a ball of fire. 38 minutes after they landed, the American force lifts off, leaving behind a burning wreck and the end of an era. They fly back towards Afghanistan, again evading Pakistani air defenses that have now been alerted by the commotion. It is only when they cross back into Afghan airspace that everyone from the men on the helicopters to the president in the White House can finally breathe a true sigh of relief. The gamble has paid off. The mission was a success. Back in Jalalabad, Admiral McRaven is waiting on the tarmac. The body bag is unloaded. McRaven looks inside. It is him. The hunt is over. The man responsible for the murder of nearly 3,000 people on September 11, 2001, has been brought to justice. The news is about to be delivered to a waiting world. Chapter 10. The Long Shadow. As the helicopters carrying the SEALs and their precious cargo cleared Pakistani airspace, the final phase of the operation began. Telling the world, in Washington, D.C., late on the evening of May 1, 2011, rumors began to swirl. News networks reported that the president would be making a major, unscheduled announcement. Speculation was rampant. Outside the White House gates, a crowd began to gather, drawn by a sense of anticipation, a feeling that something historic had happened. At 11:35 p.m. Eastern Time, President Barack Obama walked to a podium in the East Room of the White House. His expression was somber, but his words were momentous. Tonight I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama Bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, and a terrorist who's responsible for the murder of thousands of innocent men, women, and children. The news spread across the globe like wildfire. In the United States, it was met with a wave of raw, cathartic emotion that had been suppressed for nearly a decade. The crowd outside the White House swelled into the thousands, chanting USA, USA, and singing the national anthem. At Ground Zero in New York City, families of 9/11's victims gathered, some weeping, some celebrating. In Times Square, a spontaneous street party erupted. For a nation still bearing the deep scars of that September morning, it was a moment of profound relief, a sense of long-delayed justice finally delivered. It felt, for many, like the closing of a painful chapter in American history. The body of Osama bin Laden was flown from Afghanistan to the aircraft carrier USS Carl Vinson, which was on station in the North Arabian Sea. The decision had been made not to bury him on land, to avoid creating a shrine for his followers. After his identity was confirmed through DNA testing, his body was washed and shrouded according to Islamic tradition. A military officer read prepared religious remarks which were translated into Arabic by a native speaker. Then, less than 24 hours after he was killed, his body was placed on a flat board which was tipped, and he was committed to the sea. The world's most wanted man was gone. His final resting place a secret, lost to the depths of the ocean. The intelligence recovered from the Abbottabad compound was a spectacular windfall. The SEALs had recovered 10 hard drives, nearly 100 thumb drives, and numerous DVDs and documents. It was the single largest intelligence seizure ever from a senior terrorist leader. For years, analysts at the CIA would sift through this material, which revealed bin Laden's continued role at the center of al-Qaeda's global network. Far from being a mere figurehead, he had been actively involved in plotting new attacks, managing the organization's finances, and directing its strategy. The documents revealed his obsession with striking the American homeland again, his detailed plans for derailing trains and targeting major cities. The raid had not only removed the leader, but had also blinded the organization, giving the US an invaluable roadmap to its inner workings. The aftermath of the raid also raised difficult questions. The fact that bin Laden had been living for years in a large compound in a Pakistani garrison town, just a short distance from the country's top military academy, fueled intense suspicion about official Pakistani complicity. The Pakistani government vehemently denied any knowledge of his presence, expressing outrage at the violation of their sovereignty by the American raid. But for many in the US government, it was inconceivable that he could have lived there for so long without some level of support or willful blindness from elements within Pakistan's powerful ISE intelligence agency. The relationship between the two countries, already strained, plunged into a deep crisis of trust, from which it has never fully recovered. The death of bin Laden was a devastating blow to al-Qaeda. It robbed the group of its founding father, its most charismatic leader, and its central symbol. His successor, Ayman al-Zawahiri, lacked bin Laden's prestige and was a far less inspiring figure. The loss of the Abbottabad files also led to the targeting and elimination of other key al-Qaeda leaders. The core organization was severely degraded, its ability to plan and execute large-scale 9/11-style attacks crippled. However, the ideology he unleashed did not die with him. The war he started did not end. The long shadow of his actions continues to stretch across the 21st century. His brand of violent jihadism proved to be a resilient and adaptable virus. It metastasized into new groups, new franchises, and new battlefields, from al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula to ISIS in Iraq and Syria. The hunt for one man was over, but the broader struggle against the movement he created would continue, a generational conflict with no clear end in sight. The 10-year hunt for Osama bin Laden was a monumental undertaking, a story of failure and redemption, of frustration and ultimate success. It was a story of the thousands of anonymous intelligence analysts, soldiers, and spies who dedicated their lives to the mission. It was a story of two presidents from different parties who shared a common, unwavering resolve to find him. It stands as a testament to the capacity of a nation, when focused and determined, to pursue its enemies to the ends of the earth. But it is also a story of immense cost, in lives lost, in treasure spent, in the complex moral compromises made in the name of security. The hunt for Osama bin Laden defined an era. It changed the way America sees the world and the way the world sees America. It reshaped foreign policy, expanded government surveillance, and altered the balance between liberty and security. The ghost of the Hindu Kush is gone, buried at sea, but the world he made, a world of perpetual conflict, heightened fear, and enduring uncertainty, remains. The long shadow of the man in the Abbottabad compound is still with us, a permanent feature of the landscape he so violently and irrevocably changed.